Howdy, Immortallium here, and today I'm going to be reviewing The Thief, Inoue Akikazu, and Other Stories by Osamu Tezuka. As far as I can tell, this is the last physical release of an Osamu Tezuka title that Digital Manga Publishing released. I do remember there was another release scheduled called Metamorphose, or Metamorphose, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it, but that seemed to get cancelled, and as far as I can tell, that never got an actual physical release. So as far as we're concerned, this is the last Digital Manga Publishing release of an Osamu Tezuka title in the physical format. And just before we start taking a look at this particular title, I just want to bring some attention to that. So Digital Manga Publishing, obviously a very important company when it comes to releasing Osamu Tezuka titles in English. They released a lot of very important titles: Alabaster, Unico, Wonder 3, and Ludwig B, among many, many others. So they're a very important publisher in that regard. But they were also a publisher that had a lot of problems. They were very reliant on Kickstarter, very limited in their distribution platforms, etc., etc. I had a lot of problems with them, and it seems that in recent years they've gone pretty quiet. They're still a company that is running, as far as I can tell, like they still exist, but they've gone pretty silent on social media. They don't really seem to release new titles, etc., etc. Now, thankfully, other publishers seem to have picked up Osamu Tezuka titles. We've seen some releases from Kodansha, Titan Manga, and Ablaze. So that's, fantastic. But given that this represents the end of a very important era in Osamu Tezuka releases in English, it'll be interesting to see if this manages to reach the high standards of Osamu Tezuka, as well as if it'll be a fitting swan song for this particular period in time. So with all that out of the way, what are my thoughts on The Thief, Inoue Akikazu, and Other Stories by Osamu Tezuka? And that's what I'm going to be discussing today. So let's get started. So what are the stories that are presented in this work? So the very first story is called The Tale of Peter Curtin and is set in Dusseldorf, where there is a serial killer called the Vampire of Dusseldorf. And the main character, Peter Curtin, is a devoted member of his workers' union, but he gets involved in these incidents when his wife is chased by a man who she believes could be the Vampire of Dusseldorf. And at first that sounds like a very interesting premise, but there are a lot of issues in this story, and actually I will say it's my least favorite out of all of these short stories. So my biggest issue with it is how it communicates information to the audience, how it handles exposition, essentially. There's a lot of information that is explained to us in the first half of the story, and not only does it feel like it drags at a lot of sections, but also ultimately a lot of this information didn't feel very necessary. But while the second half of the story is superior to the first half, in that, there's a lot of events that actually happen during it, I still think it's quite weak overall. The twist, which, whether or not it's meant to be a twist, I'll talk about that in a moment, I predicted pretty early on, so it didn't really get me from there. Now, the reason that I bring up that kind of quote-unquote twist is because at the very end of the story, we're actually told that this is based on a true story, and it turns out it is based on a true story. There was an actual serial killer called the Vampire of Dusseldorf, and so obviously if you're familiar with that story, you'll actually know some of the details in this immediately. But even if that is kind of interesting, it doesn't really make up for the actual story itself. So unfortunately, this opening story was one of the weakest that I've read from Osamu Tezuka. It wasn't a particularly good start for the book. Now, the second story, Sensual Nights, is set in Southeast Asia, where a Japanese businessman is paying a lot of money to sleep with a woman who is apparently both immortal and really beautiful. And if the first story was something that I didn't particularly enjoy, this was a story that I found quite forgettable. While it does cover an interesting theme in terms of Japanese war guilt, it also felt like the story was quite rushed. It felt like there wasn't really too much development, not much reason for me to care about the characters themselves, or to get intrigued by the premise. Among all of Osamu Tezuka's stories, particularly his short stories, Sensual Nights is probably his most forgettable one, in my personal opinion. Thankfully, if I've sounded quite negative up to this point, that shifts a bit with this next story, because The Suspicious Lord Mogami is easily my favorite story in this short story collection. It's set during feudal Japan. We follow a peasant called Pipi. He has a family, a wife and 4 children, and he dreams of becoming a samurai. And one day, the local lord comes to him and offers to hire him. And it turns out that this job that he's working towards is actually going to be his body double. He's going to serve as the body double for this daimyo. And I ended up really enjoying this story. I really liked the character development that happened with PP as the story went on. There was kind of a big shocking moment early on in the story that kind of just caught me off guard with how blunt it was. But it made me really intrigued to see how PP would respond to it. And I ended up really enjoying it. Now, the story isn't without its flaws. I do think, as short as it is, it actually overstays its welcome a little bit. I do think the ending could have been a little tighter. But besides that, The Suspicious Lord Mogami was a great read. I really enjoyed it. The fourth story, Lady on the Rhine, follows a young Japanese woman who has arrived in Dusseldorf. We're back there again, who's arrived due to her husband's work. But unfortunately, she sees him in the arms of another woman one day, and after confronting him on it, he abandons her. And through some circumstances, she ends up living with this local lady called Lady Rathwood. And I will say, folks, at first, I was really into this story. I was quite enjoying it. I thought it was intriguing. I liked the themes that it was handling. And then we got to the ending, and the ending, to describe it as disappointing is understating it. It was a complete letdown. Basically completely ignoring the central conflict of the story, just kind of rushing to wrap things up. It was incredibly disappointing, which I think is a shame given how much I was into the rest of the story. And then we get on to the final story, the titular The Thief Inoue Akikazu. And this is easily the longest story in this collection as well. So it begins set during the final years of World War II, and we follow a character called Inoue Akikazu, a thief, who arrives in a village in Hokkaido. And soon after he arrives in this village, a bunch of natural disasters begin to occur. The fields are torn apart, the earth begins to rise, and this local postmaster called Masao Mamatsu takes it upon himself, with his very limited resources, to document the changes that occur here. And this is a very intriguing story for multiple reasons. One of the things that stood out immediately to me was the mention at the beginning that Osamu Tezuka actually went out and did some research. He interviewed an individual at Sobetsu City Hall, and he also consulted the Showa Shinzen museum files as well. So immediately I could tell that there was some very big significance to this. And the reason for that is that it's based on the true story of this postmaster observing the formation of this volcanic dome called Showa Shinzan. And a lot of the information in this story is genuinely interesting. Seeing the techniques that the postmaster used to chart this formation, fascinating. Seeing the way that the land changed and shifted, fascinating. So would you believe me if I said that I struggled to enjoy the story? And there is one very specific reason for it, and that is the character of Inoue Akikazu himself. He is an insufferable individual. He likes to steal a lot of stuff. He's very self-centered. He does some pretty bad things with regards to a woman near the beginning of the story. And at first I was willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. I was thinking to myself, sometimes with stories, you need to have someone be real bad at the beginning so that they can have a redemption arc later on, or to learn something, to change themselves, etc., etc. But he didn't really. Over the course of the story, he remains pretty much as insufferable as at the beginning. And there was one moment that kind of stood out as, maybe being the turning point for him. That maybe he could begin his redemption arc here. But then through happenstance, he kind of just gets forced back into the main events of the story without his own, personal decision. And I can't really say that I care for the way that this particular story ended either. Particularly in regards to him. So as you can imagine, that was quite a disappointing aspect. An interesting story with lots of interesting information, one that is dragged down by a horrible character who basically never changes over the course of it. Now with regards to the artwork of this, so 4 of these stories came out during 1972 and 1973, with the last story, the titular story itself, being released in 1979. And I have to say that I really, really love a lot of the artwork in this. This was about the time when Osamu Tezuka began incorporating Gekiga techniques into his distinctive style. And I've always loved the blend of these two styles. You really wouldn't think that they would work together, but they really, really do. The characters themselves look great. There's a lot of detail in the backgrounds. His panel use is superb, as well as like use of negative spacing. It's a really, really beautiful looking presentation. Now, that's not to say that it isn't without flaw. And to give an example, there is a particular panel in The Tale of Peter Curtin which looks really weird. It looks weird for a couple of reasons. One, that there might have been some kind of odd technique done with the background. But one as well, if you take a look at Peter Curtin's legs here, it just clashes so much with the rest of the art style in the story that it just kind of really seemed off-putting. You see a couple of those moments throughout. But besides that, it's a really, really lovely looking manga. Now, with regards to the presentation of this by Digital Manga Publishing, so first thing to note, of course, is the fact that it's in its usual larger trim size. If we compare it to my trusty Yotsuba, you will see that it's considerably larger than a standard tankobon, which of course is great. The paper quality itself also is pretty good, with the black and white artwork really contrasting nicely with each other. So that's good, and very little bleed through in terms of the pages as well. In terms of extras, at the back of the book is included an afterword by Osamu Tezuka with regards to the thief Inoue Akikazu, which is fantastic to see. You also get a page after that detailing when these stories were released and in what magazine. This is fantastic information to get, and I'm always happy to see that included. But there is kind of an odd kind of quality of life that I'm not really sure was necessary. So there's a couple of notes included in The Tale of Peter Curtin, and to give one example, because a term necrophilia is used in between the borders of the panel, they include an explanation of what necrophilia is. And I was a little confused about this because I don't think the term necrophilia is an unknown term. This is a pretty mature book, and also I think the story itself gives enough context that you would understand what necrophilia is if you didn't know what the term meant. So I thought that was a bit of an odd inclusion. Kind of confused me when I came across it. Whether or not you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know, but it's worth highlighting. I only recall coming across these little notes during The Tale of Peter Curtin. I don't recall coming across them in the other short stories. The one other thing I want to highlight about Digital Manga Publishing's release of this book is a little bit of an odd detail, and that's to do with this cover. This cover is custom made, just like most of Digital Manga Publishing's releases, and for the most part, it's an okay cover. There's one little detail that I can't say that I care for, which is this little heart that's over her lips. I guess it's meant to be like a lipstick kind of thing, which just looks really weird to me. Looks almost cheap to me. And what's weird is that there's this kind of alternate cover on the inside of the book, and I think this alternate cover in the book actually looks superior to that of the cover of the main book. So I feel like they should have just gone with this one inside. I don't know, I'll leave it up to your interpretations. Again, it's not the worst cover in the world, but I do think that's kind of a weird little detail, and I just wanted to highlight it. With all that being said and done, what are my thoughts on The Thief Inoue Akikazu and Other Stories by Osamu Tezuka? I think of all the short story collections I've read from Osamu Tezuka, this is my least favorite of his. There's some good in here. There's a lot of interesting information when it comes to the real-life serial killer of the vampire Dusseldorf. You got a great story in the form of the third story here. And you've got a lot of interesting details in that last story about, the formation of a mountain and, all the stuff that happens in that. But there's just so many flaws in this collection, whether it be that awkward exposition and pacing of the first story, the really baffling ending of the fourth story, and the insufferable character of the fifth story. It becomes a little bit of a hard recommendation, at least to anyone who isn't a devoted Osamu Tezuka fan. Of course, if you're a devoted Osamu Tezuka fan, you're going to want this. Just, to be able to have read it, to experienced it, and for those good bits of information that it has. But for anyone else who's looking for short story collections from Osamu Tezuka, there's actually quite a few others that I would recommend above this one. And so it ends up being a little bit of a disappointing finale to this era of digital manga publishing releases. So that was my review of The Thief Inoue Akikazu and Other Stories by Osamu Tezuka. Hopefully you enjoyed watching this video. Please let me know anything you'd like to say in the comments below. Have you read these stories? If you did you enjoy them more than I did? Do you have any interesting, kind of details to share? Please leave it spoiler free in case, other people haven't read the short stories themselves. How do you think this compares to other Osamu Tezuka releases, and what do you think of Digital Manga Publishing overall in terms of their legacy when it comes to Osamu Tezuka titles, etc, etc. And I would also encourage you to go check out UK Anime Network, a website that covers a wide variety of Japanese media. We're talking anime, manga, video games, live action films, toys, etc, etc. And I'm covering some interesting stuff on there in terms of articles, in terms of reviews, etc, etc. So I'd highly encourage you to go check those out. I would also encourage you to go check out the affiliate links in the description below. When you purchase manga through those affiliate links, not only supporting me, not only supporting the channel, but you're also supporting the manga industry. So I'd highly encourage you to purchase manga that you're interested in through those affiliate links. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye-bye.